Mid-March 1965. The Hôpital Cochin, Rue du Faubourg Saint-Jacques, Paris. A woman lies in a ward bed on the left bank, weighing less than 60 pounds. The sheets are institutional white. The corridor light is flat. There are no flowers. There are no visitors. The attending staff know her name, Cunard, but the name means nothing here, or rather it means only what it means on every other wristband, in every other ward. A patient, a body requiring care, a set of forms. She is 69 years old. She was once photographed by Man Ray, published Samuel Beckett before anyone else would touch him, and assembled one of the century's boldest anti-racist books with her own money in her own hands. She is dying in a public hospital, alone, and nobody from the world she was born into is coming. The name Cunard once meant ships, Atlantic crossings, baronetcies, country seats, and a London salon so powerful it could make or break a reputation over a single dinner. The woman in this bed was born into all of it. The shipping fortune, the title, the estate in Leicestershire, a mother who was one of the most formidable hostesses in British society. What the public never fully understood was how completely the family would destroy itself over a single question: who a Cunard daughter was permitted to love. This is the story of a dynasty built on commercial money and converted into social authority. A mother who turned her drawing room into a weapon, a daughter who crossed the one line her world could not forgive, a black musician whose presence detonated the racial code of two continents, and an empire of silence, scandal, and punishment that lasted 34 years. This is what happened behind the Cunard name. To understand how a woman born into the Cunard name ended that way, in an institutional ward alone, her body a catalogue of what decades of combat had cost, you have to go back much further than Nancy. You have to go back to the money itself. Because the Cunards were not an ancient family. They were not medieval landowners whose coat of arms had been gathering dust since the Plantagenets. They were something more modern and in the end more fragile. A commercial dynasty that had converted profit into title, title into respectability, and respectability into a set of rules so rigid that a single daughter's refusal to follow them would be treated as an act of war. The name began with ships. Samuel Cunard was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in 1787, the son of Abraham Cunard, a master carpenter and timber merchant who had come north from Philadelphia as a loyalist during the American Revolution. There was nothing aristocratic about the start. The family belonged to the Atlantic's commercial middle, people who made things, moved things, and understood that in the colonies, money was not inherited gracefully, but earned in weather. What Samuel had was appetite, nerve, and a particular gift for seeing which way trade was moving before it fully arrived. By his 20s, he was already working in his father's business. By his 30s, he had expanded into whaling, timber contracts, and the coastal carrying trade. By his 40s, he had built a fortune of considerable size across banking, lumber, coal, and iron, the raw materials of empire laid out in a single balance sheet in a town most of London would not have been able to find on a map. But the achievement that turned a Halifax merchant into a transatlantic name was the steamship line. In 1839, Samuel Cunard secured the first British government contract for a regular mail service by steamship between Liverpool, Halifax, and Boston. The following year, the Britannia made the crossing. It was not the fastest ship, it was not the most comfortable. What it was and what mattered was reliable, regular, scheduled. Samuel Cunard had understood something that would define his family long after the ships themselves became floating palaces and then floating anachronisms. The thing the British establishment valued above almost everything else was regularity, predictability, the assurance that the machinery would hold, that the timetable would be honored, that the crossing would happen on the date printed in the advertisement. That instinct, commercial energy disciplined into dependability, dependability converted into trust, trust converted into prestige, became the family's inheritance as surely as the money did. And it became, eventually, the standard against which a granddaughter's life would be measured and found wanting. The Cunards did not stay in Halifax. As the shipping line grew, the family's center of gravity shifted to England. Samuel was knighted, his descendants acquired a baronetcy. The name migrated from the commercial registers of the colonies to the social registers of the metropole, and with each generation, the original story, the carpenter's son, the timber yards, the cotton coal, receded a little further behind the finished performance of landed respectability. By the later 19th century, the family had completed that classic British transformation in which money becomes land becomes title, and title becomes a way of forgetting where the money came from in the first place. The grandson of the Halifax merchant was now Sir Bache Cunard, 3rd Baronet, and the family seat was Neville Holt, a substantial country house in Leicestershire, with a history stretching back to the 13th century. Neville Holt carried all the correct signals: stone walls, parkland, a medieval church nearby, the surrounding village of Medbourne arranged as though the house were the gravitational center of a small and settled world. Historic England's listing describes the estate with the language of permanence. Significant architecture, historical continuity, a building that has witnessed centuries. The house came with a past that predated the Cunards by generations, which was precisely the point. When a commercial family acquires an ancient seat, it is not buying stone. It is buying the implication that the family has always been there, that the money is merely the visible portion of something deeper and older and more deserved. That was the transaction the Cunards had completed. The name no longer smelled of fish oil and lumber contracts. It smelled of oak paneling and Leicestershire turf. But even the records of Neville Holt contain a quieter story. The house passed through multiple owners. Financial difficulty attended several of its chapters. The splendor was real. The permanence was not. By the time Nancy Cunard was born there, the great house that would form the backdrop to her earliest memories was already, in one sense, a maintenance operation. Wealth, performing stability, while the underlying position was rather less secure than the stonework suggested. And this was the deeper truth about the Cunard world at the turn of the century. Everything depended on the next generation agreeing to sustain the performance. The title required an heir who would live inside it correctly. The house required an occupant who would treat it as a trust rather than a stage set. The name required someone willing to carry it without asking what it actually meant. That gap between appearance and reality was not incidental to the Cunard story. It was the family's organizing principle. And when the gap was finally exposed, it would not be exposed by creditors or accountants. It would be exposed by a daughter who refused to pretend it did not exist. Nancy Clara Cunard was born on the 10th of March, 1896 at Neville Holt, the only child of Sir Batch Cunard and his wife Maud Alice Burke. She arrived into a household that possessed everything the Edwardian world was supposed to want: title, land, money, a country seat, a position in the social order, and into a marriage that had almost nothing of what makes a marriage survivable. To understand Nancy, you have to understand the two people who made her and the domestic climate they created, because the patterns that would govern her adult life, the craving for intensity, the gift for provocation, the deep and unresolvable loneliness, the instinct for turning private feeling into public spectacle, were being laid down before she was old enough to recognize them. Sir Bache Cunard was a country gentleman of the most limited and contented kind. He was a sportsman. He liked horses, hunting, the seasonal rhythms of Leicestershire, and the company of people who shared those interests. He was neither intellectual nor socially ambitious, and by the accounts that survive, he was an affable, quiet, somewhat recessive figure. Decent rather than dynamic, comfortable rather than compelling, a man who suited a baronetcy precisely because he had no desire to make it mean more than it already did. He had the title, he had the house, he had the land and the name and the position. What he did not have was any capacity whatsoever to hold the attention of the woman he had married. That incapacity would shape the childhood of their only daughter, and through that childhood, an entire century of consequence. Maud Alice Burke was born in San Francisco in 1872. She was American, which in the context of late Victorian British society meant something very specific. She belonged to the stream of confident, moneyed, socially restless American women who crossed the Atlantic looking for something that dollars alone could not purchase. What Maud wanted was not comfort. Comfort she already had. What she wanted was centrality, the sense of being at the exact point where culture, power, taste, and influence converge. She was beautiful, formidably well-read, socially fearless, and possessed of a conversational brilliance that the British establishment simultaneously admired and distrusted. She had the American talent for treating social life as a project, something to be designed, managed, optimized, and the European instinct for understanding that the project must never look like a project. It must look like effortless authority. She married Sir Bache in 1895. She moved to Neville Holt, and she discovered, within a remarkably short time, that life in rural Leicestershire, with a husband who preferred the stable yard to the drawing room, was not the life she had crossed an ocean to live. What followed was not, by the standards of the class, unusual. Marriages of this kind did not publicly collapse. They simply emptied. The couple remained married. They remained under the same name, but the emotional substance of the arrangement drained away, and in its place grew a distance that was all the more powerful for being managed with perfect social correctness. Maud began to orient herself toward London, toward music, toward the world of salons and hostessing, where her talents could operate at full power. By 1911, she had effectively left Neville Holt and established herself in London, taking Nancy with her, not, it must be said, because she craved the child's company, but because the child was part of the apparatus of a new life. In London, Maud became one of the great society hostesses of her age. She entertained with lavish precision. She gathered around herself musicians, writers, politicians, aristocrats, and the more presentable members of the artistic world. Her dinners at Carlton House Terrace and later at Grosvenor Square became stages on which reputations were made and alliances formed. The guest list mixed cabinet ministers with conductors, ambassadors with painters, and what Maud provided was not merely food and conversation, but the particular frisson of a room in which everyone present understood they were being observed, assessed, and arranged by a hostess who treated social life as a performing art. She was brilliant at it. She was so brilliant that the power she accumulated, the ability to place a young artist in front of a patron, to bring a politician into contact with a useful peer, to make or break a social reputation with a single seating plan, was real power, even if the world she operated in would never have called it that. She became closely associated with the conductor Sir Thomas Beecham, their connection enduring, devoted, and widely understood. Maud was one of Beecham's most important patrons and supporters, and their intimacy was of the kind that Edwardian and Georgian high society absorbed without official comment. Everyone knew, nobody said, and the arrangement functioned because it obeyed the only rule that mattered, which was discretion. That detail will become important later because it shows that Lady Cunard herself lived unconventionally when it suited her. She could sustain a relationship outside her marriage for decades, provided the surface held. What she could not tolerate, such what she would punish with every instrument available to her, was a daughter who refused to keep the surface intact. She changed her name eventually from Maud to Emerald, a reinvention so complete that even the baptismal identity was discarded in favor of something brighter, harder, and more deliberately made. The National Portrait Gallery's records capture her as a defining figure of London social life in the early 20th century, and that is not overstatement. Lady Cunard did not merely inhabit the establishment, she curated it. She decided who was interesting, who was welcome, who was worth talking to, and fought with equal precision who was not. That brilliance has to be acknowledged before the story turns to its consequences, because Maud was not a cartoon villain. She was a woman of genuine accomplishment operating inside the only theater she fully understood, the theater of elite social life, where taste was currency, access was power, and reputation was the only form of capital that could be neither inherited nor bought, but only performed into existence night after night, dinner after dinner, season after season. She built something real. And the thing she built would become, when the crisis came, the weapon she used against her own daughter. Into this household, this performance of family, this architecture of emotional absence, came two figures who shaped Nancy's inner life in ways the society columns never recorded. The first was George Moore. The Irish novelist was Maud's most enduring intimate companion, a presence in the Cunard world for years, and a figure who occupied a peculiar position in Nancy's childhood. Not her father, not her mother's husband, but the man who was always there, whose relationship to her mother carried undertones the child could sense but never quite name. Moore was a literary man of real stature. His early naturalist novels had earned him genuine critical respect, and his later autobiographical writing, particularly the trilogy Hail and Farewell, had established him as one of the more interesting prose intelligences in the English-speaking world. He was also, by the time Nancy was old enough to observe him closely, an aging man of letters whose emotional entanglement with Maud gave him a role in the household that no official title described. He was there at meals. He was there in the evenings. He was there in the spaces where a father might have been. His presence meant that Nancy grew up surrounded by books, conversation, art, and adult arrangements that bore no resemblance to the official version of what a family was supposed to look like. The effect was almost novelistic in its irony. One of the mother's intimate companions became inadvertently one of the forces that pushed the daughter toward her own artistic seriousness. Moore showed Nancy very early that the world her mother presided over was crowded with talent, ambition, and appetite. He also showed her that it could be crowded with all those things and still leave a child entirely alone. The second figure was absence itself. Sir Bash remained in the background, the paternal branch of the dynasty, the baronetcy, the country house life, the masculine silence of inherited comfort. He was not cruel. He was simply not present in the way that might have mediated what was coming. He died in 1925 before the worst of the breach between Nancy and Maud reached its most public and vicious phase. That death matters structurally. The father could not arbitrate, protect, complicate, or temper the war between mother and daughter because he had already ceased to be a living force in either of their lives. In his absence, the women's conflict became entirely exposed. A confrontation between two formidable, stylish, absolutist personalities with no male buffer, no paternal authority, and no remaining pretense that a family still existed around the quarrel. Nancy was educated at schools in London, in Germany, in Paris, an itinerary that sounded cosmopolitan and was, in practice, a sequence of displacements. Each new school, each new language, each new set of corridors and unfamiliar faces reproduced the essential pattern of her childhood. She was sent places, given excellent instruction, and left to make her own emotional arrangements. She was sharp, restless, hungry for language, and already, in adolescence, developing the quality that would define her public presence, the ability to make visibility feel like an argument. She was not merely seen. She was looked at, and she arranged herself consciously, provocatively, with increasing artistic control, so that the looking would produce discomfort as often as admiration. When the war came in 1914, Nancy was 18. The world that had contained her childhood, the country houses, the London drawing rooms, the ordered Edwardian certainties, shattered with a speed that confirmed what she had perhaps already sensed, that the solidity was theatrical. The young men she had grown up around were dying in France. The social rituals continued, but they continued with a frantic quality that made their emptiness more visible rather than less. Nancy moved through the volatile milieu of wartime London. The world later remembered through the coterie and the bright young people, a circle of titled and literary youth who mixed aristocratic privilege with artistic ambition and the particular recklessness that comes from knowing the old world is already gone. She wrote poetry. She was seen at parties, at gatherings, in the company of artists, writers, and the more restless members of her class. And she was photographed. The photographs that survive from her early 20s show the beginning of what would become one of the most recognizable visual identities in modernist culture. The cropped dark hair, the kohl-rimmed eyes, the hard jawline, the ivory and African bangles stacked in quantities that turned jewelry into armor. Man Ray photographed her. Cecil Beaton photographed her. Wyndham Lewis drew her. What emerged from those sittings was not the image of a debutante or a society bride, but something else entirely. A woman who had turned her own body into a statement about the insufficiency of the world she had been born into. The visual self-construction was not vanity, it was argument. And it was also, in ways that would only become clear much later, a kind of armor against the vulnerability that no amount of coal or ivory could actually address. In 1916, at 20, she married Sidney Fairbairn. He was a cricketer and an officer. Handsome, conventional, the kind of man who made perfect sense on the guest list of a Leicestershire shooting weekend, and perfect sense, too, as a match that Lady Cunard could present to the world as evidence that her wayward daughter might yet be salvaged for society. The marriage was Nancy's single attempt at the sanctioned path. The proper engagement, the proper ceremony, the appearance of the settled domestic life her class required, and her mother would have recognized as correct. It was wartime. Young women married young officers. The conventions were observed, and the marriage lasted in emotional terms almost no time at all. The couple separated within a few years, and the divorce was finalized in 1925. The precise reasons remain private. Neither party made the failure into public drama, and the records are silent on the intimate mechanics of what went wrong. The meaning, however, does not require the details. Nancy had walked through the approved door, looked at what was on the other side, and come back out again with the knowledge that conventionality was not merely uncongenial to her, but genuinely unbearable. That experiment closed something off. Everything that followed, the lovers, the printing press, the causes, the politics, the deliberate and escalating scandal, happened on the far side of a door that had been tried once and permanently shut. After Sydney, Nancy went to Paris. Not as a tourist, not as a divorcee in genteel retreat, but as someone who had decided that the only place she could live at her full intensity was the city where art, argument, sex, and radical politics shared the same cafes and the same beds. She moved through the interconnected worlds of literary modernism, Ezra Pound, the surrealists, the expatriate Americans, the left bank circles that treated aesthetic seriousness and personal recklessness as aspects of the same project. She wrote poetry, she drank, she took lovers, and her lovers were numerous, varied, and public enough that back in London, the society her mother navigated was already composing the story it preferred. The Cunard heiress, the wayward daughter, the beautiful wreck. That version was always more comfortable than the truth, because the truth required acknowledging that Nancy was doing something harder and more deliberate than self destruction. She was building a life outside the system. She argued in public and in private with equal ferocity, and she worked. That last fact is important because it is the one that later memory found easiest to forget. In 1927, Nancy purchased a farmhouse at Rainville in Normandy and established the Hours Press. The name carried a quiet ambiguity. The hours of labor, the hours that pass, the canonical hours that mark devotion. And the press itself was a physical, muscular undertaking. Nancy acquired a Belgian Machu hand press and learned to operate it. The work was not delegated to servants or subcontracted to professionals. It was done by hand. Setting type letter by letter, inking the plates, pulling the lever, checking each proof for errors that a commercial printing house would have caught automatically. The farmhouse smelled of ink and damp paper. The output was small in scale and enormous in ambition. Over the next several years, Hours Press published Samuel Beckett's first separately issued work, a long poem called Horoscope, which won a competition the press had advertised for the best poem on the subject of time, along with work by Ezra Pound, Laura Riding, Richard Oldington, Norman Douglas, and others. The catalog was serious. It placed Nancy at the center of a network that connected the established avant-garde with the youngest generation of experimental writers. Beckett was virtually unknown when Hours Press published him. He would not remain unknown. The press was not a hobby, and it was not a vanity project dressed up in artistic language. It was editorial judgment backed by capital, labor, and physical endurance, and it produced work that entered the literary record permanently. Nancy was not merely attending parties and scandalizing photographers. She was financing and producing culture at a level of commitment that most of her critics would never manage in their own careers. That this chapter of her life was later overshadowed by the sexual and racial scandal that followed is not accidental. The establishment's portrait of Nancy as an unstable heiress required the erasure of her competence, and the competence was erased with remarkable efficiency. By 1928, the press was running, the Paris life was full, and Nancy was 32 years old. She had money, talent, a growing literary network, and a public image that already sat uncomfortably between fascination and disapproval. She traveled to Venice that year for the kind of cultural expedition that was routine for someone of her means and her milieu. Henry Crowder was already there. He was an African-American jazz musician, born in Georgia in 1890, largely self-taught, who had started playing in Washington, D.C., before coming to Europe in 1928 as part of a band engaged for an 8-week residency at the Hotel Luna in Venice. He was 38 years old. He carried with him not only his instrument and his talent, but the particular education that every Black American in Europe carried in that period, the knowledge that the welcome was real and also provisional, that European tolerance could turn performative without warning, that the politeness with which a Venetian hotel received a Black musician and the politeness with which it would later refuse him a room could sound identical. Crowder was not naive about any of this. He had grown up in the American South. He had learned through the accumulated evidence of a lifetime how to read rooms, how to gauge the distance between what was said and what was meant, how to calibrate his own presence so that the comfort of the white people around him was maintained at exactly the cost his own dignity could bear. He was by temperament cooler, more watchful, and more socially precise than Nancy. He had to be. For her, misreading a room meant embarrassment. For him, it could mean something considerably worse. They met during his Venice residency, and what began was not merely a love affair, but a reorientation so complete that it would eventually cost Nancy her family, her inheritance, her social standing, and the last possibility of return to the world she had been born into. Crowder brought her something none of her previous lovers, friends, or artistic collaborators had provided: direct proximity to the lived reality of racial injustice, and through that proximity, entry into Black Atlantic networks of art, politics, and intellectual resistance that she would never leave. This was not the same thing as reading about oppression in a Paris bookshop or debating injustice over drinks with sympathetic white intellectuals. This was sitting across from a man who had been shaped by it, whose body and biography carried its evidence, whose childhood in Georgia and working life in Washington had left him with a precise and unsentimental understanding of how race operated in every room he entered. And this was finding that his presence in her life made visible, immediately, publicly, unavoidably, the racial architecture that her entire class depended on and refused to name. The relationship was also on its own terms a collaboration. Nancy and Henry worked together. He contributed to Hours Press projects, brought his own musical intelligence into the creative environment at Rayonville, and occupied a position in Nancy's daily life that was not merely romantic but professional, intellectual, and domestic. The outline's later accounts suggest that the relationship was not without difficulty. The pressures were extraordinary, the costs unequal, the attention inescapable. But what matters at this stage of the story is that the connection was serious, and that its seriousness was precisely what made it intolerable to the world Nancy had come from. A casual liaison might have been absorbed. An affair, however public, might have been managed. What Crowder represented was something more dangerous, the possibility that Nancy meant it. By 1929, the relationship had deepened into something that could no longer be understood as a casual liaison or a passing provocation. Crowder was collaborating with Nancy at Hours Press. He was present in her daily world. He was visible. A caricature by the artist Wissard, preserved in the National Portrait Gallery's collection and dated to this period, shows how rapidly their association entered public consciousness and how that consciousness defaulted without hesitation to openly racist mockery. The image is not subtle. It is a record of the atmosphere in which this relationship existed. Watched, judged, and caricatured by a world that found a white woman's presence with a black man, not merely scandalous, but categorically threatening in a way that her previous scandals had never been. There is something in that distinction worth sitting with. Nancy had spent years defying her class through aesthetic rebellion, sexual freedom, and artistic experiment. Edwardian and post-war London had absorbed all of it. The drinking, the affairs, the surrealist friendships, the modernist self-fashioning, the refusal of the marriage market, the divorce, none of it had triggered the kind of response that was now beginning to gather. The world that had tolerated Nancy as a colorful eccentric was preparing to treat her as a contaminant. What changed was not the scale of her defiance. What changed was the color of the man beside her. That single fact reorganized everything: her mother's calculations, the press's interest, the establishment's tolerance, and the trajectory of her remaining life. By the end of the 1920s, Nancy Cunard was 33 years old. She had a press, a lover, a cause taking shape, and a family whose capacity for absorption had reached its final limit. What she did not yet have was any understanding of how total the retaliation would be. Not simply social embarrassment, not simply a mother's displeasure, but the full machinery of class, name, money, and narrative turned against a woman who had crossed the one line her world could not forgive. The next act of this story begins when Lady Cunard realizes that her daughter's life with Henry Crowder is not a phase, not a provocation, and not something that the usual mechanisms of social embarrassment and quiet correction can contain. It is a permanent departure from the order the Cunards had spent a century constructing. And in that world, permanent departures are not mourned. They are punished. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew. And we're only just beginning. For a brief period, perhaps 2 years, perhaps less, it is possible to see the shape of the life Nancy Cunard might have led if the world she came from had been capable of letting her lead it. Between 1929 and 1931, the Hours Press was producing its strongest work. The relationship with Crowder was deepening into genuine creative partnership, and Nancy herself was operating at a pitch of energy and ambition that even her admirers found difficult to match. She was writing, she was editing, she was pulling proofs at Rayonville, corresponding with authors across 2 continents, managing the finances and logistics of a small publishing house with the combination of aristocratic confidence and physical endurance that was, in retrospect, her most undervalued quality. Crowder was beside her, composing, contributing, shaping the musical dimension of projects that the press was beginning to explore. He had set some of his own music to words by poets in Nancy's circle, and the collaboration between them carried a texture that was not simply romantic but genuinely productive. They were making things together. The farmhouse in Normandy was not glamorous in the way that Lady Cunard's London evenings were glamorous. It was ink-stained, cluttered with manuscripts, noisy with argument and the mechanical rhythm of the hand press. But it was alive with purpose in a way that the Grosvenor Square drawing rooms, for all their brilliance, were not. And the press was producing work that mattered. The catalogue from this period includes not only the Beckett debut and the Pound contributions, but a range of pamphlets, translations, and editions that place Hours Press at the junction of literary modernism and the emerging politics of race and internationalism. Nancy was not simply publishing handsome books for collectors. She was assembling a list that reflected a particular intellectual vision, one in which the experimental sentence and the anti-colonial argument belonged in the same conversation, printed on the same paper, distributed through the same fragile network of bookshops and subscriptions and personal connections. Wynne Henderson, who by 1931 was handling much of the day-to-day operation of the press, enabled Nancy to extend her reach without entirely abandoning her editorial instincts, and the division of labor was itself a sign of the press's growing seriousness. It had become large enough to require management, and Nancy had found someone she trusted enough to delegate. The press was small. Its influence was not. Writers who appeared in the Hours Press catalog entered the record of literary modernism at a point where their inclusion was not yet inevitable, and Nancy's editorial judgment, the instinct for what was worth printing before the market had confirmed it, was the engine of that entry. The life at Rayonville during this period deserves a moment's attention because it is the best evidence against the portrait of Nancy that the establishment would later construct. The farmhouse was a working space. Visitors came and went, writers, artists, musicians, political acquaintances from Paris and London, and the atmosphere was one of sustained creative labor, punctuated by intense sociability. Nancy was not lounging on divans. She was handling type, checking galleys, writing letters to distributors, arguing with authors about punctuation. Crowder was composing and practicing. The press's output had a physical reality that most literary ventures never acquire. Each copy of each edition had been pulled by hand, dried, inspected, and bound under conditions that were closer to a craftsman's workshop than to a publisher's office. The woman who had been born into one of Britain's great shipping fortunes was, in her mid-30s, getting ink under her fingernails in a Norman farmhouse. That image matters because the story the world would tell about Nancy Cunard over the next 3 decades depended on its absence. Meanwhile, in London, Lady Cunard's world was at its own kind of peak. Emerald, as she now insisted on being called, the name itself a declaration that the woman from San Francisco had completed her self-invention, presided over a social theater of extraordinary density and reach. Her gatherings at Grosvenor Square brought together the political class, the musical establishment, the diplomatic corps, and the upper reaches of literary London in configurations that she designed with the precision of a stage director who understood that the seating plan was the evening's most consequential decision. Beecham was her constant, the conductor whose career she had supported with patronage, attention, and a devotion that everyone in London understood and nobody in London discussed directly. The opera was her passion. The conversation at her table was, by multiple accounts, among the sharpest and most entertaining in the capital. She had achieved what she had crossed the Atlantic 40 years earlier to achieve: centrality, influence, the sense of being the person through whom important people moved and around whom important conversations happened. She was, in her early 60s, a figure of genuine cultural power, and the power was not merely decorative. It was functional. She could make introductions that altered careers. She could withdraw invitations in ways that altered reputations. She could place a word in the right ear at the right dinner and set in motion consequences that would take months to unfold. She had spent decades building a network of social capital so dense and so finely calibrated that its operation was invisible to anyone standing outside it, and the network held. What is worth seeing in this brief window is the parallelism. Mother and daughter were both, in their different spheres, operating at full capacity. Both were creators of worlds rather than merely inhabitants of them. Both understood, instinctively and practically, the relationship between style and authority, the way a room could be turned into an argument, the way a list of names could be turned into a power structure, the way the apparently decorative work of curating an environment could function as the most serious kind of social engineering. Both were formidable, and the tragedy that was coming was not the collision of a brilliant woman with a foolish one, or a powerful woman with a weak one. It was the collision of two women who were each, in their own domain, extraordinarily effective, and whose domains had become mutually unintelligible. Maud could not read what Nancy was building at Rayenville as anything other than a more elaborate form of the Bohemian rebellion she had been tolerating with increasing strain for a decade. Nancy could not read what Maud was building in London as anything other than the ongoing performance of a class system she had already rejected. They were speaking different languages inside the same family name. That mutual incomprehension was about to become lethal. But it is important before the destruction starts to register that both the women had built something real. Otherwise, the breaking means less. The cracks, when they appeared, did not arrive as a single dramatic rupture. They accumulated. The first visible signs were social rather than personal. A shift in how Nancy was discussed, in the circles that still overlapped between mother and daughter, a change in the texture of the gossip, a hardening of the language that the people around Lady Cunard used when her daughter's name came up in conversation. Invitations that might once have been extended were reconsidered. Names that might once have appeared on the same guest list were separated. The social world that Nancy had grown up in did not deliver its verdicts through court proceedings or public declarations. It delivered them through silences, omissions, and the careful rearrangement of who was welcome where. The process was quiet. It was also unmistakable to anyone who understood how it worked. The relationship with Crowder had moved from private knowledge to semi-public fact, and the fact was being processed through a social machinery that had very specific rules about what it could absorb and what it could not. Nancy's previous scandals, the affairs, the drinking, the divorce, the surrealist associations, the photographs in which she looked like something between an Egyptian queen and a weaponized mannequin, had all been containable because they occurred within a recognizable framework. Aristocratic women could be eccentric, they could be sexual, they could be artistic, they could even be openly troublesome, and the world would find a place for them. Diminished, perhaps slightly ridiculous, but still inside the pale. What they could not be, within the racial imagination of the British and American upper classes in the late 1920s, was publicly and durably involved with a black man. That was not eccentricity, that was contamination. The word matters, because the social code that governed Lady Cunard's world did not process interracial relationships as matters of personal choice or romantic preference. It processed them as pollution events, moments at which the boundary between the acceptable and the unacceptable was not merely crossed but dissolved, threatening the integrity of the entire structure. Nancy's presence with Crowder did not embarrass her mother the way a messy divorce might embarrass her, or a drunken evening at a party might embarrass her. It endangered her. It threatened the social capital Maud had spent 4 decades accumulating, because in the world she had built, proximity to racial transgression was itself a form of disgrace that could spread from the transgressor to everyone connected to her. A mother could survive a wayward daughter. A mother could not survive a daughter who had, in the eyes of her world, crossed into another species of existence entirely. The contamination was understood to be communicable. That is the logic the entire tragedy runs on. By 1930 and into 1931, the pressure was becoming impossible to contain. Through the usual methods of social management, Nancy was not retreating. She was escalating. The relationship with Crowder was not cooling. It was deepening, and deepening publicly, in ways that could no longer be explained away as a passing phase or a temporary provocation. Nancy's politics was shifting too, from the aesthetic radicalism of the Parisian avant-garde, which the establishment could tolerate as a kind of intellectual fashion, towards something more explicitly racial and anti-colonial, which the establishment could not. Secondary but well-sourced interpretive accounts connect the final phase of the breach to 2 developments happening in concert: the visible, continuing life with Crowder, and Nancy's involvement with increasingly militant artistic and political circles, including the private screening of Buñuel and Dely's L'Âge d'Or, a film whose deliberate provocations against the church, the bourgeoisie, and respectable sexual morality made it a useful emblem of the world Nancy now inhabited and the world Maud was desperate to keep her daughter out of. The film was banned in France after right-wing protests. Nancy was not merely watching it. She was circulating in the world that defended it. For Maud's circle, this was no longer a daughter behaving badly. This was a daughter who had become, in the most literal social sense, illegible. Someone who could no longer be placed inside any category that the old world recognized as belonging to its own. And then, in 1931, Nancy made the private quarrel permanent by turning it into a public document. She wrote and published a pamphlet titled Black Man and White Ladyship. It was printed privately in a limited run and also appeared in The Crisis, the magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, under the editorship of W.E.B. Du Bois. The act of publication was deliberate, calibrated, and devastating in a way that no amount of social misbehavior or personal scandal had ever been. Nancy was not writing to her mother. She was not writing to her mother's friends. She was not writing to the society columns or the gossip networks that had tracked her movements for a decade. She was writing to a Black American readership that had no obligation to protect Lady Cunard's feelings, no investment in the social order that Lady Cunard had spent her life constructing, and no reason to read the racism Nancy was describing as anything other than what it was. The pamphlet crossed every line the social code existed to maintain. It named the racism of Nancy's own class. Not the crude, shouted racism of the street or the political rally, but the quiet, settled, atmospheric racism of people who would never dream of using a slur at dinner yet, whose entire world was organized around the absolute assumption that whiteness was a category of being and blackness was a category of otherness. It named her own family. It described the world of London society hostessing, the world Maud had built, as a world whose refinement and cultivation coexisted without contradiction, with a racism so deep that it did not even recognize itself as racism. It described the casual certainties, the drawing room assumptions, the social reflexes that treated racial hierarchy not as a position to be argued, but as a fact to be observed, like the weather or the arrangement of the table settings. And it named her mother specifically, not as a uniquely malicious individual, but as the exemplary product of a system, the woman whose brilliance and whose bigotry were not contradictions, but expressions of the same organizing logic. And at the center of the pamphlet sat the detail that survives most vividly across the sources, the detail that carries more weight than any page of analysis. The question attributed to Lady Cunard: is it true that my daughter knows a Negro? Whether Maud spoke those exact words in that exact sequence, in a single moment that can be placed at a specific date and in a specific room, or whether the sentence crystallized through Nancy's rendering of a longer and more diffuse conversation, is not fully recoverable from the accessible record. The exact circumstance remains partly in shadow, and the outline should acknowledge that ambiguity rather than paper over it. But what is not in dispute is the moral content of the question. It reduces Crowder to his race. It reduces Nancy's intellectual and romantic partnership with him to a single scandalized verb. And it reveals, with a clarity that no amount of salon wit or social polish could disguise, the assumption beneath the entire Cunard world that to know a Black man, in any sense of the word, socially, intellectually, romantically, carnally, was an offense against the natural order, not a choice, not a provocation, an offense. The question once published could not be retracted. The pamphlet once in Du Bois' hands could not be recalled. And the breach between mother and daughter, once made into printed text and circulated beyond the reach of either woman's social network, could not be repaired. Nancy had taken the most powerful weapon available to her, the truth, and used it in the one arena where her mother had no influence at all. The responses that followed tracked along the lines that each character's psychology would predict. Nancy did not retreat. The publication of Black Man and White Ladyship was not a desperate gesture or an impulsive act of fury committed in the heat of an argument and later regretted. It was a deliberate and irreversible reorientation of her public identity, away from the scandalous heiress, away from the beautiful eccentric, and toward the anti-racist intellectual and activist she had been becoming since Venice. The pain of the break with her mother was real. It would have been strange if it were not. Whatever distance had always existed between them, and the distance was considerable, structural, woven into the fabric of Nancy's childhood. The finality of the breach carried a weight that no amount of political conviction could entirely dissolve. Maud was still her mother. The Cunard name was still the name she carried. The world that had formed her was the same world she was now publicly attacking. But Nancy metabolized that pain through work rather than through reconciliation, and the work was already pulling her forward into the next phase of the project. The pamphlet had been a manifesto. What was coming would be a monument. She was not finished. She was beginning. Lady Cunard's response was the mirror image. Where Nancy turned private suffering into public accusation, Maud turned public exposure into private warfare. The exact operational mechanics of what followed are not cleanly documented in open access sources, and the outline must be honest about those gaps. What is established through the biographical and historical record is the broad pattern: social quarantine. The systematic mobilization of the networks Maud had spent decades building turned now not toward inclusion, but toward exclusion. Nancy was to be distanced, sealed off, made socially uninhabitable. The acquaintances, the dinner party world, the web of connections through which Lady Cunard's influence flowed, all of it was redirected toward a single objective: ensuring that her daughter's disgrace did not contaminate her own standing. Some biographers describe private detectives. Others describe coordinated social pressure on mutual acquaintances, quiet conversations at the right tables, the careful management of what was said and by whom. The precise mechanisms remain partly recoverable and partly in shadow. But the shape of the campaign is clear. Lady Cunard did not grieve her daughter's departure from the family's world. She managed it. She treated Nancy's relationship with Crowder and the publication of the pamphlet as a reputational emergency, and she responded with the tools she understood best: influence, access, narrative control, and the quiet, devastating power of social withdrawal. There is something in that response worth sitting with. Maud was not a stupid woman. She was not an ignorant woman. She was, in her own terms, a woman of culture, taste, and sophistication, a woman who had lived unconventionally herself, whose relationship with Beecham was an open secret, sustained across decades, whose social world accommodated appetites and arrangements that bore no resemblance to the official moral code of the Church of England or the expectations printed in Debrett's. She had left her husband, she had changed her name. She had turned her drawing room into the most powerful social instrument in London. She could forgive herself a great deal, and the world she inhabited had forgiven her too, because her transgressions were the right kind. The kind that operated within the established system rather than against it, the kind that could be acknowledged with a raised eyebrow and a discreet smile rather than a public confrontation. What she could not forgive her daughter was the one transgression that threatened the system from which her own freedoms derived. That is the particular cruelty at the heart of this story. The mother's own unconventionality depended on the survival of the order her daughter was attacking. Maud could sustain an extramarital relationship for decades because the code permitted discreet deviation, and discretion was the one social skill she had mastered absolutely. Nancy could not sustain this relationship with this man because this man's presence did not deviate from the code. It exposed it. It made visible the racial architecture that supported the entire system of taste, access, and social legitimacy within which Maud operated. And visibility was the one thing the code could not survive. Once the structure was named, it could be questioned. Once it could be questioned, the authority of everyone who depended on it, Maud above all, was at risk. The mother's fury was not simply personal, it was structural. Nancy had threatened the foundations of the building in which Maud lived. The disinheritance, or repudiation, entered the public record around this time, and it entered with the particular force that attaches to a story about money and morality colliding inside a famous name. By 1932, when Nancy reached New York, the word disinherited was already attached to her in press captions, a single word that did enormous narrative work because it told the reader simultaneously that she had possessed something valuable, that she had done something to lose it, and that a parent had judged her unworthy. The exact legal form that the exclusion took is not fully recoverable in accessible sources. Whether it was a formal alteration to a will, a trust restructured, or a less legalistic but equally effective withdrawal of financial support and familial recognition. The outline should describe this carefully because fabricated trust language or invented legal mechanics would undermine the authority of the narrative. What is secure is that Nancy became publicly and durably known as the Cunard daughter who had been cut off, financially, socially, and emotionally, over her association with a black man and the political stance that association had produced. The repudiation was public enough to generate press headlines on both sides of the Atlantic. It was total enough to alter the material conditions of Nancy's life in ways that would compound across the decades that followed. And it was permanent enough that no later gesture, however tentatively offered, could reverse the damage that had been done to the relationship between mother and daughter, or to the financial position of a woman who had once been understood as the heir to one of Britain's most recognizable fortunes. For Henry Crowder, the fracture carried a weight that the white participants in the drama could not fully comprehend. He was not a member of the Cunard family. He had never occupied a place inside the British establishment that could be revoked, because the establishment had never offered him one. But he was now irrevocably the figure around whom the entire scandal was organized, the black body at the center of a white family's implosion. He was the reason the pamphlet existed, the reason the mother and daughter were at war, the reason the press was shifting from society gossip to something more racially explicit and more hostile. He was in every headline and every caption, identified first and sometimes only by his race. The cost to Crowder was real, and it was different in kind from the cost to Nancy. She had chosen this confrontation, she had initiated the pamphlet, she had decided at every stage to escalate rather than retreat, and she had done so from a position, however diminished by disinheritance, by the whiteness, education, and class identity that could never be fully taken from her. Crowder had not chosen to be the catalyst for the destruction of a British dynasty's internal peace. He had fallen in love with a woman, and the world had decided that his love was an affront to the order of things. The asymmetry is important, and the script should not smooth it over. Nancy paid in money, status and family. Crowder paid in dignity, visibility, and the particular exhaustion that comes from being reduced, again and again, by people who do not see you, to the single fact of your race. What surrounded them both, in the months that followed the pamphlet's publication, was the gathering machinery of spectacle. The press had found a story it understood: heiress, scandal, race, inheritance, family warfare, and it was not going to release it. The headlines multiplied. The tone hardened. Nancy's name, which had once appeared in society columns as source of mild amusement or aesthetic fascination, now appeared in language designed to provoke outrage, pity, or contempt, depending on the publication and its audience. The word disinherited recurred like a subtitle. The word Negro appeared in every account, placed with the precision of a weapon. The press was not interested in Hour's Press, in Beckett, in the literary catalog, in the political argument of the pamphlet, in the anti-colonial networks Nancy was building. It was interested in the heiress who had taken up with a black musician and lost everything. That was the story. That was the only story, and the machinery for telling it was already running by the time Nancy became aware of what it was doing to her. Then came the hate mail. Once the press had leaked the connection between Nancy and the pamphlet, letters began to arrive. Letters whose content, later transcribed and included in the anthology she was already planning, testified to the depth and the violence of the racism she had named. The letters were crude, threatening, sexualized, and saturated with the particular fury that is produced when a social taboo is violated by someone who was supposed to uphold it. They came from strangers. They came from people who had never met Nancy, never read her poetry, never seen her press's catalog, and who knew nothing about her except that she was a white woman of title and money who had publicly associated herself with a black man. The letters are important because they demonstrate what the establishment preferred to leave implicit. The racism Nancy described in Black Man and White Ladyship was not a polite disagreement. It was a structure of violence. And when that structure was challenged, the violence came to the surface. Nancy's enemies, and by now they included a considerable portion of the British social establishment, as well as the tabloid press on both sides of the Atlantic, had begun writing her story for her. The Cunard daughter who had gone mad, the Cunard daughter who had gone native, the Cunard daughter who had thrown away everything for a Negro musician. The language varied. The reduction did not. She was being explained away, and the woman who had built a publishing house, edited serious literature, and produced a public document of genuine intellectual courage was being compressed in the newspapers and in the whispered judgments of her mother's world into a cautionary tale about what happened when a woman of breeding crossed the line that her entire civilization had been built to maintain. But something else was happening simultaneously, and the establishment preferred not to examine it. The pamphlet had reached its audience. Du Bois had published it. Black readers in America had encountered it. Nancy's name was beginning to circulate not only as scandal, but as solidarity. A white woman of wealth and title who had stood up publicly and at enormous personal cost against the racism of her own class. That circulation was pulling her westward. It was pulling her toward America, toward Harlem, toward the world that the pamphlet had addressed and that was in turn addressing her. She was already planning a much larger project, an anthology that would document the Black experience across continents, across centuries, with the seriousness and the scale that the subject demanded and that no publishing house in the English-speaking world had yet attempted. The pamphlet had been the declaration. The anthology would be the proof. And to build it, she would have to go where the material was. Harlem, when she arrived, would become the next theater of a war that was no longer merely personal, no longer merely familial, and no longer containable within the drawing rooms and society columns of the world that had produced her. It would also become the place where the British and American press would converge on her, with a ferocity that made the London gossip look restrained. By the spring of 1932, Nancy Cunard was 36 years old. She had lost her mother, though Maud was still alive. She had lost her inheritance, though the exact mechanics of that loss remained, like so much in this story, partly obscured behind the family's own talent for managing what was seen and what was not. She had lost the possibility of return. What she had not lost was velocity. The quarrel was about to cross the Atlantic, arrive at a hotel in Harlem, and become a spectacle that would fix the name Cunard for the rest of Nancy's life to a story the world found far easier to tell than the one she was actually living. Nancy Cunard arrived in New York in the spring of 1932, and what happened next turned a family quarrel into a transatlantic media event. She did not check into the kind of hotel a woman of her name and background was expected to use. She did not stay on the Upper East Side or in Midtown, among the white expatriate and society circles that would have received a Cunard with the appropriate mixture of curiosity and deference. She went to Harlem. She took a room at the Grampian Hotel, a hotel patronized by black guests in the heart of the neighborhood that was then the cultural and political center of Black America, the Harlem of the Renaissance, of Langston Hughes and Duke Ellington, of rent parties and radical newspapers, of a community that had built a world of extraordinary richness inside the boundaries that white America had drawn around it. She was 36 years old. She was there, she said, to gather material for a book on the colored race. She was also there to support the Scottsboro Boys, the 9 young black men who had been convicted in Alabama on fabricated charges of rape, sentenced to death by all white juries, in a case that had become one of the defining racial injustices of the American decade and a rallying point for civil rights and left-wing organizations around the world. The Scottsboro case was not a footnote in Nancy's Harlem visit. It was a declaration of political intent. She was not in Harlem as a tourist. She was there as a participant. She was visible. She was photographed. And the press, which had been tracking her since the pamphlet and the disinheritance descended with the particular appetite that attaches to a story in which the available ingredients, sex, race, class, money, family, betrayal, are so rich that almost any arrangement of them will produce a headline. The scene at the Grampian in early May 1932 is one of the saga's most cinematically dense moments, and the sources provide enough material to reconstruct it with some specificity. A Getty Images press caption, dated the 2nd of May 1932, describes Nancy as the apparent heiress to the Cunard fortune who had taken up residence in a Harlem hotel while gathering material for a new book. A photograph from the same period, preserved in multiple archives, shows her on the steps of the Grampian with 2 companions. John Banting, the English surrealist painter who had been part of Nancy's artistic circle in Europe, and Taylor Gordon, the African-American writer and singer from Montana whose autobiography, Born to Be, had been published to some acclaim a few years earlier. The 3 of them stand together in daylight on the steps of the hotel with the easy posture of people who are at home in each other's company. Banting and Gordon were not props. They were Nancy's actual companions, a white English artist and a black American writer whose presence together, with Nancy at the center, embodied the kind of interracial creative solidarity that was the entire point of her visit and the entire source of the scandal. A Christie's description of a later copy of Negro notes an association with Taylor Gordon specifically, which suggests that his connection to the project was not merely personal, but practical. He was part of the Harlem Renaissance world from which Negro would draw its authority. The image is important not because of what it showed, 3 people standing on the steps of a building, but because of what it meant to the press that printed it and the public that consumed it. Here was a white woman of title and shipping money, flanked by a white artist and a black writer, residing voluntarily in a black hotel in a black neighborhood, and claiming that she was there not for scandal, but for serious intellectual work. The press did not know what to do with that claim, because the claim required treating Nancy as a professional rather than a spectacle, and the press had already invested too heavily in the spectacle to abandon it. So it did what press does when it encounters something it cannot categorize cleanly. It turned the woman into the story and ignored the work she was there to do. The reporters came. They came from the New York dailies and the London tabloids, with the particular energy that attaches to a story in which sex, race, class, and money converge so completely that every detail becomes usable and every photograph becomes evidence. A summary of the coverage preserved in the National Archives notes a Daily Express extract in which Nancy, seated on a glass-top table, spoke of gathering material for her book and of her support for the Scottsboro case. The detail of the glass-top table matters, not because of the table itself, but because of what the reporters were doing with such details. They were not recording Nancy's words or engaging with her ideas. They were building an atmosphere. They were constructing a scene in which every physical element, the hotel, the neighborhood, the furniture, the woman's posture, the lightness of her skin against the darkness of the space she had chosen to inhabit, was made to signify something about racial transgression and class betrayal. The questions they put to her were not about literature or civil rights or the Scottsboro case or the scope of the anthology she was researching. They were about the gap between what Nancy was supposed to be and where Nancy was choosing to be. Every headline, every caption, every photograph was designed to amplify that gap until it swallowed everything else about her: her intelligence, her work, her argument, her purpose. The academic and archival record has since reconstructed how rapidly the images and headlines circulated and how thoroughly they dominated the public narrative of Nancy's visit. The journal Modernism Modernity has published work analyzing the 1932 media archive around Nancy's Harlem stay, and the analysis confirms what the headlines themselves suggest: that the press coverage operated as a machine for converting a political act into a sexual scandal. Nancy's body, a white, female, aristocratic body in a black space, was treated as the story. Her reasons for being there was secondary at best, and in most of the coverage entirely absent. Her book was not mentioned, or was mentioned only in passing, as a convenient excuse for a presence that the press had already decided to interpret through the lens of racial and sexual deviance. The word heiress appeared in every account, a designation that simultaneously elevated her origins and emphasized the distance she had fallen. The coverage was not journalism in any meaningful sense. It was the enforcement of a racial boundary conducted through the apparatus of the free press, and it functioned exactly as intended. It made Nancy's presence in Harlem uninhabitable long before the hotel made it official. And then the Grampian expelled her, or she was made to leave, or the circumstances of her departure were arranged in ways that made the distinction between expulsion and managed withdrawal largely academic. Press captions from mid-May 1932 describe her as having been turned out of the hotel. The Daily Mirror presented what it called her reluctant departure as front-page material, complete with the kind of language that signaled to readers that the story was really about sex and race, even when the words on the page were nominally about accommodation. The full chain of causation behind the departure is not cleanly recoverable in open access sources, and the outline should be candid about that rather than inventing a scene that might not have happened in the form the invention suggests. What is clear is that her presence at the hotel had become untenable, not because she had done anything illegal, disruptive, or objectionable, but because the intensity of the press attention and the nature of the publicity had made it impossible for the hotel to continue accommodating her without absorbing the scandal itself. The Grampians' management was running a business in a black neighborhood in a city where racial politics were already volatile and where the wrong kind of attention from the wrong kind of newspaper could have consequences that extended far beyond a single guest booking. Nancy's presence had turned their establishment into a stage, and the play being performed on it was not one they had agreed to produce. The departure from the Grampian is a scene the script should handle with particular care because it concentrates several layers of meaning into a single event. Nancy was not turned out of a white hotel for being black. She was turned out of a black hotel for being too white, too visible, too famous, and too useful to a press corps that would not leave her or her host alone. The irony is precise and cruel, and it runs deeper than simple reversal. The woman who had crossed the racial line in order to stand in solidarity with black struggle found that her very presence, her name, her whiteness, her celebrity, her Cunard legibility, could be weaponized against the community she was trying to support. Her solidarity was genuine. Her disruption was also genuine. Both things were true at once, and the hotel had to deal with both simultaneously. The press had followed her into Harlem not to cover what she was doing, but to turn what she was doing into proof of what they had already decided she was: a fallen heiress, a race traitor, a woman whose presence in a black space was inherently scandalous regardless of her stated intentions. And the hotel, caught between a guest whose purposes were sincere and a media environment whose purposes were predatory, made the pragmatic choice. Nancy left the Grampian. The press reported her departure with satisfaction, and the story moves forward. The departure from the Grampian did not end Nancy's time in America, and it did not dampen the press's appetite for the story. If anything, the departure itself became a new chapter in the narrative the newspapers were constructing. The heiress who had been turned out of a hotel in Harlem, the woman so scandalous that even the community she claimed to support could not accommodate her, the captions wrote themselves. The Daily Mirror's coverage made the front page. The American papers recycled the story with their own commentary, and the result was a transatlantic echo chamber in which each country's press confirmed the other's assumption that Nancy Cunard was a woman out of place everywhere, belonging to no world accepted by none. That version of the story would prove remarkably durable. It was still circulating decades later, long after the reporters who had filed the original dispatches had moved on to other scandals and other heiresses. But Nancy was not performing for the newspapers. She was working. And what followed the Harlem episode was not retreat, but escalation of a different kind. Slower, more sustained, more laborious, and ultimately more consequential than anything the press had expected or wanted. Nancy had come to America to gather material, and gather material she did. Over the months that followed, she traveled across the United States and into the Caribbean, meeting with Black intellectuals, artists, musicians, political organizers, anthropologists, historians, and ordinary people whose experiences of racial injustice she intended to document with a comprehensiveness that no previous English language publication had attempted. She was building the anthology that would become Negro, a project whose scale and ambition dwarf anything she had undertaken at Hours Press and anything the establishment that had excommunicated her would later find it convenient to remember. The work was enormous, and it was not glamorous. Nancy was not simply editing submissions and arranging them between covers in a comfortable study. She was commissioning contributions from people she had to find, contact, persuade, and in many cases meet in person. People who were not always easy to reach, who did not always trust a white English aristocrat's motives, and who required reasonably enough evidence that this project was something more than the latest enthusiasm of a woman the newspapers described as unstable. She was conducting interviews in cities and towns across the American South and the Caribbean, in communities where a white woman's presence was unusual and where the history of white interest in Black life had taught people, with good reason, to be cautious about offers of solidarity that came with celebrity attached. She was financing the entire operation from her own diminishing resources. The disinheritance had reduced her means considerably, though not yet to the poverty that would characterize her later years. And she was doing so while managing the logistics of international correspondence, the editorial challenge of assembling contributions in multiple languages and from multiple academic and artistic disciplines, and the relentless emotional toll of the family breach, the public exposure, and the constant unrelenting scrutiny that attached to everything she did. Every interview required travel. Every piece of correspondence required postage. Every rejected contribution required a replacement. Every delay required patience that was being drawn from a reservoir that was not bottomless. She kept working. The project expanded beyond its original scope, as serious projects always do when they are driven by genuine intellectual ambition rather than by a predetermined conclusion. What had begun as a book about Black culture became something more ambitious and more unwieldy, a comprehensive documentation of the Black experience across Africa, the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe, encompassing history, anthropology, music, art, literature, politics, economics, and personal testimony. Nancy was attempting in a single volume to produce the kind of archive that entire research institutions would later struggle to maintain. That she was doing it largely alone, largely out of her own diminishing pocket, and largely while under sustained attack from the press and completely estranged from her family, is a fact that the story must hold in view because the later erasure of her competence depended on exactly this kind of labor being treated as invisible. Langston Hughes contributed, W.E.B. Du Bois contributed, Zora Neale Hurston contributed, George Padmore, the Trinidadian Pan-Africanist whose political analysis would influence anti-colonial movements across the globe, was part of the project's intellectual orbit. Louis Armstrong's name would appear in the finished volume. So would Samuel Beckett's, a connection that linked the literary avant-garde Nancy had nurtured at Hours Press with the anti-racist political work she was now undertaking. The breadth of the contributor list was itself a political statement. Negro was not a book about Black America alone. It was a book about the Black experience everywhere, documented by voices from across the African diaspora and by white allies whose engagement was intellectual rather than touristic. Nancy was the editor, the organizer, the financier, and the driving wheel behind the project. She corresponded with contributors across time zones and languages. She chased deadlines, mediated disagreements, and made editorial decisions that required her to engage with material, ethnographic, historical, musical, political, far outside her own area of expertise. Whatever else the world chose to say about her, this was not the work of a dilettante. It was the work of someone who had decided that the only adequate response to the racism she had witnessed was a record so comprehensive that denial would become intellectually untenable. Meanwhile, the relationship between Nancy and Henry Crowder was entering a different and more difficult phase, one that the script should render with honesty, rather than with the kind of romance that flattens real people into symbols. The pressures on them had been extraordinary from the beginning, and they had only intensified. The public attention, the racial hostility, the financial strain, the disinheritance, the hate mail, and the sheer emotional weight of being the couple around whom an entire social scandal was organized, all of it had consequences that no relationship, however genuine its foundations, could absorb without cost. Crowder had his own career, his own needs, his own threshold for endurance, and his own assessment of what the situation was doing to him as a man, as a musician, and as a person who had not asked to become the most famous black partner of a white aristocrat in the English-speaking world. He was not merely Nancy's companion in struggle. He was a man with his own life, and the life he was living had been reshaped in ways he had not chosen and could not fully control by the fame, the fury, and the racial spectacle that surrounded them both. The sources do not provide a single clean break date or a single dramatic scene of separation between Nancy and Crowder. What they provide is a sense of a connection that was strained by the same forces that had brought it into being. The world that made their relationship political also made it public, and the publicness consumed the private space in which a relationship might have sustained itself. They had loved each other. They had collaborated. They had produced between them a body of creative and political engagement that neither would have achieved alone. Crowder had given Nancy her political education. Nancy had given Crowder a platform and an introduction to networks he might not otherwise have reached. The exchange had been real, and it had been genuinely mutual, which is why the later press narrative, in which Crowder was reduced to a scandal prop and Nancy to a woman who had thrown herself away, was not merely unkind but false. But the cost of being the couple, of being the visible, named, photographed, captioned, scandalized couple at the center of the Cunard saga, was not equally distributed. It never could have been. Nancy paid in money, status, and family. Crowder paid in dignity, autonomy, and the particular exhaustion that comes from being made to represent, against your will, everything that a white world fears about black male presence. His trajectory would carry him away from Nancy's orbit in the years that followed. Her trajectory would carry her deeper into the political work that had begun with him, but would continue long after the personal connection had changed its shape. In London, Lady Cunard continued. That is perhaps the most striking and most revealing thing about Maud's thread. During this period, she continued. The salon world operated, the dinners were given, Beecham was supported and accompanied. The social calendar was observed with the meticulous regularity that had always been Maud's signature. Whatever private anguish the breach with Nancy had caused, and it is difficult to believe it caused none, however expertly it was buried beneath the surface of performance, Maud's public life showed no disruption that the society press could detect. The machinery of her world was designed to absorb private damage and present an unblemished surface to the world, and in this it functioned exactly as designed. Nancy's name, in Maud's circles, became one of those subjects that everyone in the room understood was not to be raised. The silence was not accidental. It was not the natural fading of a topic that had lost its interest. It was active, maintained, and enforced by the unspoken consensus of a social world that understood its hostess's requirements without needing to be told. Guests who might have mentioned Nancy's name learned, through the atmospheric signals that Lady Cunard's world communicated with such fluency, that the subject was closed. The silence was the sound of a mother who had decided that her daughter's existence, in its present form, was a problem best managed by behaving as though it had ceased. And the silence worked. In Maud's world, Nancy became, for all practical purposes, invisible. Not dead, not disowned in any publicly dramatic fashion, but simply absent, as though she had wandered off the edge of the social map and the cartographers had agreed not to update their records. By 1934, Negro was finished. It was published by Wishart and Company in London, and its physical existence was a statement before a single page was read. The volume ran to more than 850 pages. It contained contributions from some 150 voices. The material spanned continents and centuries, essays on African sculpture and music, analyses of the economic structures of colonialism, accounts of the black experience in America from slavery through the present, documentation of Caribbean culture and politics, historical studies, political arguments, musical analysis, literary contributions, and photographic records. The scope was not merely ambitious, it was unprecedented. No English language anthology had attempted anything comparable. A single volume that sought to document the fullness of Black civilization and the totality of the systems arrayed against it. De Christie's description of a copy that later appeared at auction is particularly useful here because it captures not only the scale and ambition of the book, but a detail that belongs at the center of the story. The inclusion, within the anthology itself, of transcribed hate letters, the letters Nancy had received after the press leaked her involvement in the project. The letters were crude, threatening, racially and sexually violent, and they were not relegated to an appendix or presented as curiosity. They were published as part of the argument. Nancy did not merely document the Black experience from the position of an outside sympathizer. She documented the white reaction from the position of a woman who had experienced it directly. The hatred, the threats, the sexualized abuse that had been directed at her for the crime of crossing the racial line her civilization had drawn. The hate letters were evidence. They demonstrated in language that could not be euphemized or explained away exactly what the polite world preferred to keep behind closed doors. They were the voice of the drawing room stripped of its manners, and Nancy printed them alongside Du Bois and Hughes and Hurston and let the writer draw the connection. The book's reception was complicated, and the complications themselves tell a story. Negro was too large to be easily reviewed. Many reviewers, confronted with 850 pages of densely argued material spanning multiple disciplines, simply did not know where to begin. It was too ambitious to be easily categorized. Was it an anthology, a reference work, a political tract, an artistic statement, or all four simultaneously? The establishment predictably found it easier to discuss the scandal than to engage with the scholarship. But there were reviewers, and there were readers, who recognized what Nancy had accomplished. The New Yorker's obituary, written close to her death 3 decades later, would remember the volume as immense and hopeful and far in excess of what a casual society rebel could have produced. That assessment was generous. It was also accurate. And the book existed. It sat on shelves. It entered libraries. It could be consulted, cited, argued with, built upon by future scholars and future movements. Its existence represented something that the press coverage, the disinheritance, the Harlem spectacle, and the years of social punishment had all been designed to prevent. The conversion of Nancy Cunard's transgression into durable, serious, permanent work. The establishment could call her mad. It could call her reckless. It could reduce her to a cautionary tale about heiresses and Black musicians and the dangers of crossing boundaries that existed for everyone's protection. What it could not do, once Negro was printed and bound and sitting in the British Museum's collection, was pretend that she had produced nothing. The escalation pattern that defined this entire phase of the story deserves a moment's recognition because it reveals the governing logic of the Cunard saga and because it is the pattern that the establishment most needed to obscure. Each attempt to reduce Nancy to scandal produced more work from her. Each new provocation from the press, each piece of social punishment from her mother's world, each hate letter, each tabloid caption, each whispered reduction of her to a cautionary tale about heiresses and Black men, all of it was metabolized not into silence or retreat, but into further engagement, further documentation, further commitment to the cause that had cost her everything the Cunard name was supposed to guarantee. The pamphlet produced the Harlem Trip. The Harlem Trip produced the research for Negro. The research produced the book. The book produced more hostility, which would produce in the years ahead more work, journalism from the front lines of the Spanish Civil War, activism on behalf of refugees, political engagement on an international scale that took Nancy far from the drawing rooms in which her story had begun. The cycle did not stop because Nancy did not stop. And the world that wanted her to stop, the world that needed her to collapse, to retreat, to prove by her failure that her rebellion had been a mistake, had no mechanism left except the one it had been using since 1931. The slow, patient, grinding work of turning a serious woman into a cautionary story and hoping that the story would stick more firmly than the facts. That machinery was effective. It is important to acknowledge that because acknowledging it is necessary for understanding what happened to Nancy's reputation in the decades that followed. The establishment's version of Nancy Cunard, in the version in which she was a beautiful, reckless, self-destructive heiress who threw away everything for a love affair and a cause that consumed her, was not simply wrong. It was a construction, assembled with the same social precision that Lady Cunard brought to her seating plans, and it served the same purpose: to maintain the boundary between the world as it was supposed to be and the world as Nancy had described it. If Nancy was mad, her accusations could be dismissed. If she was self destructive, her work could be pitied rather than read. If she was simply a scandalous woman, the scandal could be the story, and the story could end with a shake of the head and a murmured observation about the dangers of excess. The real Nancy, the editor, the journalist, the anthologist, the political intelligence, had to be erased for the establishment's narrative to hold. And for a very long time, the erasure held. By the end of 1934, Nancy Cunard had survived social excommunication, tabloid siege, the loss of her family, the strain and probable end of her most important relationship, and the enormous labor of assembling one of the century's most ambitious anti-racist documents. She was 38 years old. She was thinner than she had been. She was more isolated than she had been. She was running out of the money that had once seemed inexhaustible. And the emotional resources that had sustained her through the previous 5 years, the fury, the conviction, the sheer refusal to be reduced, were still present but no longer unlimited. The cost of what she had done was beginning to show on her body, in her finances, and in the narrowing of the social world available to her. She had traded the Cunard inheritance for a different kind of legacy, and the exchange, however principal, was not free. But she was not finished, because history itself was about to demand something from her that went beyond personal rebellion or family warfare or even the anti-racist labor that had defined her 30s. Europe was sliding toward fascism. Germany had already fallen. Spain was approaching its catastrophe. And Nancy Cunard, who had spent 5 years fighting the racism of her own class, was about to discover that the fight had always been larger than one family, one pamphlet, or one 800-page book. The next act of this story opens on a continent at war and on a woman who had already learned, at terrible personal costs, that telling the truth in public was not something she could stop doing, simply because the truth had become more dangerous and the audience less willing to hear it. Within 2 years of Negro's publication, Europe began to tear itself apart, and Nancy Cunard, who might, in another life, have retreated into the quieter work of literary editing and cultural commentary, threw herself into the destruction with the same appetite for total commitment that had driven her since Venice. Spain came first. The Spanish Civil War, which erupted in July 1936 when Franco's military rebellion fractured the Republic, became the political cause of Nancy's generation in a way that no previous conflict had been. It was not distant, it was not abstract, it was happening in a country she knew, to people she had met, and it presented the kind of moral clarity that Nancy had been seeking since the pamphlet. Fascism against democracy, military power against civilian life, the forces of reaction against the forces of progress. She did not observe the war from Paris. She went to Spain. The Manchester correspondence in the university's digital collections confirms that Nancy wrote for the Manchester Guardian, one of the most respected liberal newspapers in Britain, on the final stages of the Spanish Civil War and the humanitarian catastrophe that accompanied Franco's advance. She reported from Perpignan and the French border region in 1938 and 1939, where the collapse of the Republic was producing a tide of refugees that the French government was struggling and in many cases actively refusing to accommodate. The conditions were appalling. Hundreds of thousands of Spanish civilians and soldiers crossed the Pyrenees into France in the winter months, carrying what they could, leaving behind everything they could not, and arriving in a country that received them not with shelter, but with barbed wire. The French authorities herded them into improvised camps, open fields on the coastal plain, exposed to the winter wind off the Mediterranean, with inadequate food, no sanitation to speak of, and guards whose instructions were to contain rather than to comfort. The camps had names that would later enter the historical record as bywords for democratic Europe's failure of conscience. Nancy was there. She saw the camps. She wrote about them. She filed dispatches for a newspaper that would print them alongside advertisements for country houses and announcements of society weddings. And the dissonance between the content she was producing and the world that was consuming it was itself a measure of the distance she had traveled from Neville Holt. The Spanish work matters to the documentary's architecture because it represents the moment when Nancy's trajectory shifts from personal rebellion to something larger and more impersonal. The fight with her mother, the relationship with Crowder, the scandal, the press persecution, Negro, all of that had been in one sense her own story, her own family, her own class turned against her. Spain was different. Spain was other people's suffering, documented by a woman who had no personal stake in the outcome except the political convictions that her earlier work had forged. She was now a journalist, an activist, and a witness, and the causes she served were not about the Cunard name or the Cunard inheritance or the question of who a Cunard daughter was permitted to love. They were about refugees freezing in camps, about fascism's advance across a continent, about the failure of democracies to protect the people they claimed to represent. That widening of scope was both heroic and corrosive. Nancy had found a cause commensurate with her capacity for total commitment. But total commitment, sustained across years and in conditions of genuine physical hardship, the cold of the border camps, the inadequacy of the accommodation available to a journalist without an expense account, the emotional toll of witnessing suffering she could document but could not stop, consumes the private ground on which a life can remain habitable. She was living by conviction at a cost her family's world had never equipped her to survive, and the cost was beginning to show in her body, in her drinking, and in the fragility that people who met her during this period began to notice beneath the familiar defiance. The war years, the Second World War, which followed the Spanish catastrophe almost without pause, absorbed Nancy further into the machinery of anti-fascist work and into a life of increasing precariousness. When France fell in 1940, Nancy was in the country she had made her home. The occupation disrupted everything: movement, communication, the fragile networks of solidarity and friendship that had sustained her since the break with her family. The details of her wartime activities are scattered across archives in Texas and Manchester, and the full picture requires reconstruction from fragments rather than from a single clean narrative. What is clear is that she continued to write, to campaign, to involve herself in causes related to refugees and racial justice, and to live with a restless, driven intensity that left no room for the kind of settled existence that might have provided a foundation for the decades ahead. She was aging in a way that her class and her generation had not been prepared for. The women of Lady Cunard's world aged inside a structure: marriage, a household, a social position, the settled rhythms of the season and the country weekend. Nancy had rejected that structure at 25 and had never replaced it with anything that offered comparable insulation against the consequences of time. She was drinking more heavily than she had in her 30s. Her finances were contracting steadily. The money that had once funded a printing press, an 850-page anthology, years of international travel, and the day-to-day expenses of a life lived across multiple countries was no longer inexhaustible, and without the Cunard inheritance, which had been withdrawn or withheld in the breach with Maud, there was no reserve to draw on when the money ran short. She was living, for the first time in her life, without the cushion that wealth provides, and the cushion's absence was felt not as a single dramatic crisis, but as a slow, constant grinding pressure on every aspect of daily life. The pattern was becoming clear to anyone who cared to look. She was spending herself, in every sense, faster than she could be replenished, and the world around her was too preoccupied with its own destruction to notice the quieter destruction happening inside one woman's life. It was during this period that the state entered the story with a clarity that the earlier chapters had only implied. The National Archives' framing of Nancy Cunard's relationship with the British state is powerful in its concision, and it belongs in the script because it makes the larger argument legible without melodrama. On the 1948 Empire Windrush passenger list, the vessel that carried the first large group of Caribbean migrants to post-war Britain, and that has become one of the defining symbols of the Black British experience, Nancy Cunard described herself simply as a writer. That is what she was. That is what she had been for decades. But other records held by the state described her differently. In official documents, she appeared as a well-known extremist, whose activism had attracted police and security attention. That juxtaposition deserves a moment's stillness. A woman who had edited one of this century's major anti-racist anthologies, who had reported on refugees from the front lines of the Spanish Civil War, who had spent years working on behalf of people whose suffering the British establishment preferred not to examine, could be filed, watched, and remembered by the machinery of the state through the language of disorder. The word extremist does particular work here. It does not describe a specific criminal act. It does not identify a specific threat. What it does is place the person outside the boundaries of acceptable opinion, outside the pale, beyond the limit of what can be tolerated, in the territory where surveillance replaces engagement and where the label itself becomes the justification for the attention. The woman who had been socially excommunicated by her mother's world for crossing the racial line was now being officially categorized by the state for crossing the political one. The name changed, the mechanism of exclusion did not. Lady Cunard died in 1948. Maud was 75 years old. She had spent the war years in London, diminished in circumstances. The Blitz had disrupted the geography of entertaining. Wartime austerity had reduced the scale of her operations. And the social world she had commanded with such precision was itself contracting as the old order gave way to something less hospitable, to American-born hostesses with expensive tastes and limitless social ambition. She had moved from Grosvenor Square to the Dorchester, and the move itself told a story. From a private address of her own design to a hotel, however grand. Where the rooms were not hers to arrange, she was still entertaining. She was still sharp. She was still, by the accounts of those who saw her in her last years, possessed of the conversational brilliance and the social will that had made her one of the defining figures of London's interwar decades. But the world that had been her stage was contracting around her, and the woman who had once been able to reshape the social landscape of a capital through the force of her personality and the precision of her guest list was now operating in a diminished theater. Her death closed one of the story's central threads without resolving it. There had been no reconciliation with Nancy. There had been no final conversation that the record preserves as a moment of understanding, forgiveness, or even acknowledgement that the breach had cost both of them something irreplaceable. The mother who had curated London's most brilliant drawing rooms, who had sustained a decades-long intimacy with Beecham, who had changed her own name and reinvented herself with an audacity that her daughter might, in other circumstances, have admired, died with Nancy still estranged, still categorized in her mind as the daughter who had crossed the unforgivable line. The timing carries its own bleak poetry. Maud died in the same year that the Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury, bringing the post-war Black Atlantic into Britain in a form that could no longer be managed through the discrete social mechanisms of exclusion and silence. The world Lady Cunard had embodied was already becoming historical. The world Nancy had tried to name was arriving on the dockside. Henry Crowder died in 1955, a decade before Nancy. His later life did not receive the same mythological attention that Nancy's attracted. There were no tabloid updates, no society whispers, no periodic press sightings of the man who had once been the most scandalous black lover in the English-speaking press. His relative invisibility in the later record is itself a statement about whose story the world considered worth preserving and whose story it was content to let fade. He had returned to America. He had continued to live, to play, to exist in the world as a man rather than as a symbol. The details of his final years are less fully documented in the accessible record than Nancy's, and the script should note that absence rather than fill it with invention. What can be said is that the man whose presence had detonated the Cunard world, the man whose love for a white aristocrat had triggered disinheritance, a pamphlet, a transatlantic scandal, and a breach that no one would ever repair, ended his life without public spectacle, without press attention, and without the kind of dramatic decline that attended Nancy's final years. The elegy for Crowder is a separate thing from the elegy for Nancy, and the script should allow it its own register. A man who had loved, collaborated, been scandalized, been reduced to a caption and a color, and then been largely forgotten by the narrative machinery that had once found him so enormously useful as a provocation. After the war, after Maud's death, after Crowder's departure from her life, and then from the world entirely, Nancy's trajectory narrowed with a steadiness that was itself a kind of violence. Not dramatic, not sudden, but relentless. The word that recurs across the biographical summaries is breakdowns. Columbia University Press's biography summary mentions a series of them. The Harry Ransom Center's material traces the same pattern from a different angle. What is meant by breakdowns in this context is not always clinically specified in the accessible sources, and the script should avoid diagnosing what the record does not diagnose. What the sources describe consistently is a woman whose physical and psychological resources were depleted by decades of combat, by drinking, by poverty, by loneliness, by the cumulative toll of living without the insulation that money and family provide against the consequences of intensity. She was ill. She was thin. Thinner than she had been even in the angular 20s photographs, thin in a way that spoke not of fashion or of choice, but of deprivation. She was, by the accounts that survive from people who encountered her in these later years, a figure who retained the force of her personality, the sharpness of mind, the political conviction, the refusal to defer or to soften, inside a body that was increasingly unable to sustain it. The spirit and the flesh were diverging, and the divergence was visible to everyone who saw her. The last years should not be written as a descent into pathos, because Nancy would not have wanted pathos and the story does not require it. They should be written as a narrowing, the slow, implacable contraction of a life that had once encompassed Venice and Paris and Harlem and Spain and the Caribbean and the entire restless geography of the Black Atlantic into something smaller and harder and more confined. Janet Flanner, the New Yorker's Paris correspondent and one of the most perceptive observers of the city's expatriate world, would later remember Nancy as a woman who had moved through Venice, Vienna, Madrid, Florence, and Harlem with the energy of someone for whom borders were irrelevant. Stillness was intolerable, and the next cause was always more urgent than the last. That was the woman of the 20s and 30s, the woman in the photographs, the woman in the bangles, the woman whose physical presence in a room altered the atmosphere of the room. The woman of the late 50s and early 60s was different in every way that the body makes visible. She was still in France, still writing when she could manage it, still committed to the causes that had defined her adult life. But the physical and financial and social capacity to sustain the life she had chosen was failing, and the structures that might have supported her in that failure, family, money, a network of daily care, the accumulated infrastructure of a settled existence, had been withdrawn decades earlier or had never been built at all. The gathering storm before the end is not a single dramatic scene that can be reconstructed with the precision the script has brought to earlier episodes. It is the accumulation of years in which the world gradually ceased to have a place for Nancy Cunard. She had no family to telephone, no household to return to, no fortune to cushion the decline. She had the archive of her work, the books, the pamphlets, the journalism, the correspondence, the proofs from Hours Press. But archives do not keep a person warm or fed or connected to the living world. The establishment that had excommunicated her had moved on. The radical networks she had served were absorbed in new struggles and new generations. The friends who remained were scattered across countries, and many of them were dead. The body that had once been photographed by Man Ray and Cecil Beaton, that had been the most visually arresting presence in any room in Paris or London, was now the body of a woman approaching 70 who had lived harder and longer and with less protection than her constitution could sustain. In the early months of 1965, Nancy was in Paris. She was 68 years old. She had been living in France for years, drifting, ill, diminished in every measurable way from the woman who had once commanded the attention of 2 continents. The circumstances of her final hospitalization are not narrated in granular detail in the accessible sources, and the script should not invent what cannot be documented. What is known is that she was found in a state of physical collapse, emaciated, unwell, unable to sustain herself outside the care of an institution, and that she was taken to the Hôpital Cochin. The Hôpital Cochin sits on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Jacques on the left bank in the 14th arrondissement. It is a public hospital. It has served the sick of Paris since the 18th century. It is a place of long corridors and institutional light, of wards where beds are arranged in rows and where the sound environment is the low, mechanical hum of a medical facility, rather than the conversation, the music, the clinking glass, and the laughter that had once filled the rooms Nancy moved through. There is nothing about the Hôpital Cochin that resembles Neville Holt, or Grosvenor Square, or the farmhouse at Réonville, or the Hotel Luna in Venice, or the Grampian in Harlem, or any of the dozens of hotels and apartments and borrowed rooms in which Nancy Cunard had lived her itinerant, combative, relentless life. It is a place where people go when there is no other place left to go. And that is where the daughter of the Cunard shipping fortune, the woman Man Ray had photographed, the editor of Negro, the reporter from the Spanish border, the woman whose bangles and coal and jawline had defined an entire era's image of aristocratic rebellion, spent her final days. The exact date of her death carries a slight discrepancy in the accessible sources. Some accounts place it on the 15th of March, others give the 16th or the 17th. The archival instability is itself a small, apt detail, the kind of detail that in another family's story might be a minor bibliographic footnote, but that in Nancy's case feels like a final instance of the pattern that had governed her entire public life. The record of her existence was never quite under anyone's control, never quite settled, never quite the version that the official world preferred. Even in death, the facts refused to be tidy. She died in the Hôpital Cochin in mid-March 1965. She was 69 years old. There is something in the setting that the script must allow to speak without commentary, because the contrast does the work that adjectives would only diminish. The hospital ward, the institutional white of the walls, the sheets, the light, the narrow bed, the body in the bed, a body that weighed, by some accounts, less than 60 pounds at the end, a body from which the last reserves of physical substance had been withdrawn by years of deprivation, illness, and the particular kind of self consumption that attaches to people who spend everything they have on everything except themselves. The absence of anyone from the world she had been born into, no family at the bedside, no representative of the Cunard name or the Cunard fortune, no emissary from the society that had produced her and expelled her, no one from the London drawing rooms or the Leicestershire country house, or the shipping offices where the name still meant schedules, reliability, and the orderly crossing of the Atlantic. Just the hospital, just the staff, just the institutional machinery of care in its most impersonal form. The woman who lay in that bed had been, at various points in her life, one of the most photographed women in Europe. She had been painted, drawn, caricatured, captioned, and reproduced in newspapers across 2 continents. The images from her 20s and 30s, the kohl, the cropped hair, the hard jaw, the bangles stacked like armor from wrist to elbow, the posture that turned aristocratic bearing into modernist provocation, had entered the visual language of the century. Cecil Beaton had photographed her. Man Ray had photographed her. Wyndham Lewis had drawn her. She had been beautiful in a way that was not soft or inviting, but angular, confrontational, and deliberate. Beauty as argument, beauty as refusal, beauty as the visible surface of a will that would not be bent. That beauty had long since been consumed. The body at the end bore no visible relationship to the body in the photographs. The contrast between the two, the icon of the 20s and the patient of 1965, is not something the script needs to underline. It is the central image of the entire story. Everything the Cunard dynasty had built, everything it had represented, everything it had used to define who belonged and who did not, comes down to this: a hospital ward in Paris, a woman who weighs almost nothing, and the silence of a family that no longer exists. Nancy Cunard died without the presence of anyone who shared her name, because there was no one left. Sir Botch had died in 1925, 40 years earlier, before the worst of the story had even begun. Maud had died in 1948, 17 years earlier, without reconciliation, without a final conversation that the record preserves, without any gesture of understanding or forgiveness that reached across the breach the pamphlet had opened. Crowder had died in 1955, 10 years earlier, in America, far from Nancy's orbit. His later life undocumented by the press that had once found his presence so enormously useful as a provocation. There were no children. There were no siblings. There was no next generation to carry the name, or to contest the inheritance, or to stand in a hospital corridor and receive the news. The dynasty that had begun with a carpenter's son in Halifax, that had built itself into a shipping empire and a baronetcy and a country seat and one of the most recognizable names in transatlantic society, ended not with a titled funeral or a succession or a reading of a will in paneled chambers, but with a single woman dying in a public hospital after decades of poverty, illness, and the particular kind of abandonment that is produced when a family decides that one of its members has crossed the line from which there is no return. The first hours and days after her death were quiet rather than dramatic, and the quietness itself was the final statement the Cunard story had to make. There was no great public mourning. There was no state tribute. There was no obituary in the Times that ran to the length her life deserved, though Janet Flanner would write about her in the New Yorker with the kind of perceptive tenderness that Nancy might have recognized as genuine understanding. There was no family gathering, because there was no family left to gather. The Harry Ransom Center's records note the death in Paris and the subsequent handling of her remains across England and France, the administrative business of closing a life that had been lived across borders and that now required the cooperation of 2 countries' bureaucracies to bring to its administrative end. The paperwork, the arrangements, the disposition of belongings, the question of what to do with the books and the correspondence and the accumulated paper of 40 years of work. All of it proceeded with the bureaucratic ordinariness that attends every death, regardless of the name on the certificate or the life that preceded the certificate's necessity. The woman who had once moved through the most brilliant rooms in Europe, who had published Beckett before anyone else would touch him, who had assembled one of the century's great anti-racist documents, with her own money and her own labor, who had reported on refugees from the Spanish border and been surveilled by the British state and been written about in every society column and tabloid in the English-speaking world. That woman was now a body in a hospital and a set of forms to be completed. The ship still sailed. The Cunard name still appeared on the hulls of ocean liners crossing the Atlantic on schedule, just as Samuel Cunard had intended. But the family behind the name was gone. The line had ended. The dynasty that had built itself from timber and coal into the most regular and reliable crossing service in the world had produced, in its final generation, a woman too irregular and too unreliable for the world the dynasty had made. And the world had punished her for it, steadily and without interruption, for 34 years. What survived her immediately was not a legacy in the conventional sense, not in the sense that the word legacy carries when attached to shipping fortunes and baronetcies and country seats. There was no estate to distribute. There was no title to pass. There was no great house to maintain, no trust to administer, no line of succession to observe. Neville Holt had long since passed out of the family's hands. What survived was paper. Manuscripts, correspondence, drafts, press clippings, proofs, photographs. The physical residue of a life that had been lived in public and in print. The collections that would eventually reach the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas and the John Rylands Library at the University of Manchester were the real inheritance, though nobody standing in that hospital corridor in March 1965 would have described them in those terms. The archive was not yet an archive, it was just the accumulation of a lifetime's paper, the material evidence of a woman who had written, edited, published, campaigned, argued, and borne witness, and whose work the world had not yet decided how to value. The question that hung over the days and weeks that followed Nancy Cunard's death was not a question about her character or her choices or the scandal that had defined her public image for 30 years. It was a question about narrative. Who would get to tell her story? The society version, in which she was the brilliant, beautiful, doomed heiress who had thrown herself away on a black musician and a series of radical causes, who had descended through scandal and madness into poverty and a lonely death, was already written. It had been written by the press, by the gossip columns, by the whispered judgments of her mother's world, and by the accumulated weight of decades of repetition. That version was tidy. It was satisfying. It confirmed everything the establishment believed about what happened when a woman of breeding crossed the line. The other version, in which Nancy Cunard was a woman of serious intellectual commitment, who had built a publishing house, edited a landmark anthology, reported on war and refugees, fought racism and fascism with equal determination, and been punished for it by every institution her class had built to protect itself. That version had not yet been fully assembled. It existed in fragments, in the archive, in the memories of the people who had worked with her, in the pages of Negro, in the journalism from Spain, in the letters and the pamphlets and the proofs pulled by hand on a Belgian press in a Norman farmhouse. But it had not yet coalesced into the counter-narrative that would eventually, slowly, incompletely begin to challenge the establishment's preferred story. That work would take decades. And the final act of this story is about who did that work and what they found and what remains. The recovery came slowly, and it came through paper rather than spectacle. In the years immediately following Nancy's death, the version of her life that circulated most widely was the version the press and the establishment had been constructing since 1931. The heiress, the scandal, the black musician, the bracelets, the breakdown, the lonely end, and that narrative had the advantages of simplicity, of familiarity, and of moral tidiness. It confirmed what the world already believed about what happened when a woman of privilege abandoned the code that was supposed to govern her life. It was a story about excess and punishment, and it required nothing of its audience except a shake of the head and a murmured observation about the dangers of crossing boundaries. It was also, in almost every particular that mattered, a lie, not because the events it described were false, but because the events it omitted were the ones that gave the life its actual meaning. For years, that version held. Nancy Cunard was remembered, when she was remembered at all, as a figure of style rather than substance. The woman with the bangles, the woman with the lovers, the woman who had scandalized 2 continents and ended badly. The literary and intellectual circle that had known her work firsthand were aging, dispersing, dying. The Harlem Renaissance scholars, who might have connected Negro to its proper context in the history of anti-racist thought, were contending with their own struggles for institutional recognition and academic legitimacy. The British establishment, which had spent decades explaining Nancy away, had no incentive to revisit its verdict. The popular culture of the mid 20th century was not yet interested in the kind of painstaking archival recovery that would be required to assemble the counter narrative, and so the establishment's version persisted, not because it was defended with any particular vigor, but because it required no effort to maintain. It was the default. It was what people heard when they heard the name Cunard in connection with anything other than a ship, the heiress, the scandal, the end. It asked nothing of its audience except pity and a certain satisfied sense that the natural order, however briefly disturbed, had reasserted itself. Pity is the cheapest of the emotions available in response to a story like this, and it was pity, not outrage, not curiosity, not intellectual engagement, that the establishment's version was designed to produce. The first serious attempt to recover what the establishment's version had erased came through biography. Anne Chisholm's Nancy Cunard, published in 1979, 14 years after Nancy's death, was the work that began to reposition the subject from cautionary spectacle to serious historical figure. Chisholm had access to the archives, to the correspondence, to the surviving networks of people who had known Nancy across the decades of her public and private life, and what she produced was a portrait that acknowledged the scandal, the drinking, the breakdowns, and the genuine difficulty of Nancy's personality while insisting, with the quiet authority of patient research, that these things were not the story. The story was the work, Hours Press and its contribution to literary modernism, Negro and its place in the intellectual history of anti-racism, the journalism from Spain, the activism on behalf of refugees, the sustained engagement with racial justice that had been maintained across 3 decades at escalating personal cost. The biography did not sentimentalize Nancy. It did not smooth away the sharp edges or pretend that the drinking and the breakdowns were irrelevant. What it did was restore proportion. It gave back the dimensions that the press had stripped away and that polite memory had been content to leave missing. Lois Gordon's later biography, published by Columbia University Press, pushed further into the political and intellectual substance of Nancy's life. Gordon's framing emphasized the wartime journalism, the anti-fascist reporting, the civil rights work, and the sustained engagement with racial justice that the earlier, more society-focused accounts had not fully addressed. What emerged from Gordon's research was not the heiress who had thrown herself away, but the woman who had spent decades building the kind of record that institutions typically produce, the archive, the anthology, the journalism of witness, and who had done it without institutional support, without family backing, without financial security, and under sustained attack from the press, the state, and the social world that had formed her. The recovery work connected, in ways the biographers may not have fully anticipated, with larger movements in scholarship and public history, the growing academic interest in the Harlem Renaissance and its transatlantic connections, the re-examination of interwar anti-fascism, the development of Black British history as a discipline, and perhaps most resonantly, the ongoing public reckoning with the Windrush generation and the racism that had greeted Caribbean migrants to post-war Britain. Nancy's story, once recovered from the scandal narrative that had buried it, turned out to speak directly to questions the 21st century was asking about race, class, empire, and the cost of dissent inside a system that demanded conformity above all else. The cultural afterlife of Nancy Cunard has been revealingly more literary and archival than cinematic, a distribution that itself tells you something about the kind of story she left behind. There has been no major film. There has been no prestige television series of the kind that has brought other British dynasty stories into popular consciousness. A BBC Radio 4 play, That Cunard Woman, was broadcast in 1989, and from the descriptions that survive, it appears to have foregrounded the glamorous and romantic dimensions of the story, the visual icon, the love affair with Crowder, the color and danger and defiance of the life. That is not a criticism of the play, which operated within its medium and the conventions of its moment. But it is worth noting that the strongest recovery work has come not through dramatization, but through the quieter, slower, less commercially attractive labor of scholarship, through biographers, archivists, curators, and later writers working methodically through the Ransom Center collections, the Manchester materials, and the related archival holdings that constitute the material remains of Nancy's working life. That distribution matters because it reveals something about how the story has been valued. Nancy Cunard has not become canonical public myth in the way that some dynasty stories have. The kind of story everyone knows the outline of, even if they have never read the details. She has remained a difficult, half-remembered, incompletely understood figure who requires reconstruction. The kind of subject that archives yield up slowly, reluctantly, and only to people willing to do the sustained work of separating the person from the legend. The public narrative shifted over the decades in ways that track the changing preoccupations of the cultures doing the remembering, and the shifting itself is worth following because it enacts the argument of the documentary in compressed form. The earliest memory, closest to the life itself, still saw the personality. Flanner's piece, written for The New Yorker with the intimate authority of someone who had known Nancy and the expatriate Paris that had shaped her, remembered the conversationalist, the beauty, the traveler, the literary presence whose force of personality was unforgettable even, perhaps especially, when her material circumstances were dire. That was the Nancy of lived experience. The woman people remembered sitting across from, arguing with, being startled by. It was a personal remembrance, not a critical assessment, and it carried the warmth and the sadness of someone mourning a friend rather than evaluating a career. The next layer of memory, arriving through fashion writing and art criticism in the 70s and 80s, remembered the visual icon. The bracelets, the Brancusi portrait, the Man Ray photographs, the modernist self-fashioning that had made Nancy's image one of the most reproduced and most recognizable visual signatures of the interwar avant-garde. That version had its own validity. Nancy had, after all, invested enormous creative energy in the construction of her visual identity, but it was truth at the level of surface, precisely the level at which the establishment had always preferred to engage with her, because surfaces can be admired, reproduced, and celebrated without their politics being addressed or their implications being confronted. The more recent recovery, the layer now accumulating through scholarship, public history, and curatorial work in the 21st century, has been interested in something else entirely. It has been interested in the anti-racist archive, in the global scope of Negro and its place in the intellectual history of Pan-Africanism, in the Spanish Civil War reporting, in the Black Atlantic networks Nancy built and sustained, and in the fact that official records once labeled a woman who had spent her life fighting racism and fascism as a well-known extremist. This is the layer that matters most to the documentary's argument because it enacts the thesis in miniature. What the world first chose to keep was the spectacle. What later, harder, slower work has tried to recover is the seriousness beneath it. The establishment's version of Nancy Cunard served the establishment. The archival version serves the record. And the distance between those two versions is the distance the entire story has been measuring. What remains of the Cunard dynasty in physical terms is Neville Holt, though not as a private family seat and not as anything Samuel Cunard or Sir Bache would have recognized as continuous with the world it built. The house passed out of the Cunard's hands decades ago. It served as a preparatory school for much of the 20th century, an educational institution occupying the shell of an aristocratic one, which carries its own quiet structural irony. In more recent years, Neville Holt has been restored and repurposed as a cultural venue and the home of an opera festival, a use that echoes through the family's history in ways that no one could have planned. Maud, just with her lifelong devotion to music, to Beecham, and to the belief that the arts required wealthy patronage to survive, might have approved. Nancy, seen with her lifelong suspicion of the culture her mother curated and the social order that sustained it, might have seen something both fitting and absurd in the spectacle of opera, returning to the house from which her mother had once departed for London, leaving a daughter behind. The house survives, the dynasty does not. The building endures through repurposing, through adaptation, through the willingness of later owners to make it mean something new. The family that once filled it endures only in the archive and in the stones. What remains of Nancy herself is scattered across institutions on 2 continents, and the scattering is itself a final image of the life. The Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas holds the major collection: correspondence, manuscripts, papers, photographs, and the accumulated documentary evidence of a life lived in print and in public and in transit between countries that never quite felt like home. The John Rylands Library at the University of Manchester holds related materials, including correspondence connected to the Manchester Guardian journalism and the broader arc of Nancy's political and humanitarian work. The National Portrait Gallery in London holds portraits and photographs of Nancy, of Crowder, of Maud, that preserve the visual record of the family's public presentation and its private dissolution. Copies of Negro sit in research libraries around the world, 850 pages of testimony, To what one woman, working largely alone, largely at her own expense, and largely under sustained attack from the world that had produced her, could assemble when she decided that the racism of her civilization needed to be documented rather than merely endured. There are no living principles to account for, no children, no grandchildren, no surviving members of the immediate family whose current circumstances the script might describe. The Cunard family line ended with Nancy. The shipping name persists, attached now to cruise liners, to a leisure industry whose relationship to Samuel Cunard's mail packets is largely one of branding rather than continuity. The name floats on the Atlantic as it has since 1840, but the family behind it is gone. What survives is the archive. The paper, the photographs, the books, the pamphlets, the proofs pulled by hand on a Belgian press in a Norman farmhouse. And the question, still unresolved after 60 years, of whether the world is finally ready to read what Nancy Cunard was trying to say. The daughter of the Cunard shipping fortune died in a Paris hospital after a life in which the world found it easier to remember her bracelets, her lovers, and her breakdowns than the fact that she spent years assembling one of the era's boldest anti-racist books, reporting on refugees and fascism, and telling the truth about the civilization that had produced her. What this family's story reveals is not simply that wealth fails to protect, or that privilege comes with a cost, or that mothers and daughters can destroy each other across the barrier of a social code. It is something more specific and more modern than any of those formulations. The Cunard name became a disciplinary instrument, a way of deciding who belonged inside memory and who must be pushed out of it. Nancy inherited money, visibility, access, education, and style. She did not inherit a permission to cross the racial line her world depended on, or to turn the family's privilege against the civilization that had granted it. She used the freedoms her class had purchased to say the wrong thing, love the wrong man, make the wrong alliances, and tell the truth too publicly. The punishment was not one moment, it was a lifetime of being explained away,